Imagine standing in a primeval forest of the Pacific Northwest. Silence. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a blanket. Trees stretching 200 feet into the sky. Giants older than nations. Their trunks so massive that 10 men holding hands couldn't circle them. Now imagine that silence shattered. The year is 1905. Something is coming through these mountains. Something that walks on steel legs. Something that shouldn't exist. A 42-ton mechanical spider that climbs over railroad tracks, lifts itself on hydraulic limbs, and moves entire forests down from slopes where horses died trying. They called it the McGiffert Loader, and it changed everything. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. This machine was born from desperation, from broken backs and crushed bodies, from an industry on the edge of collapse, staring at billions of board feet of timber, locked in mountain valleys that might as well have been on the moon. Let me paint you a picture of the problem. It's 1900. America is exploding. Cities rising like weeds. Breaky. Every building, every railroad tie, every floorboard needs wood. Millions upon millions of board feet. The demand is insatiable, and the Pacific Northwest has the supply. Douglas firs, western red cedars, Sitka spruces, trees so enormous they make modern lumber look like toothpicks. But there's a catch. The biggest, most valuable trees aren't growing in convenient flat valleys. They're clinging to mountainsides, wedged into gorges, standing in places where the terrain itself becomes a weapon. The old method, horses and oxen, teams of animals dragging logs through mud and over rocks. It was brutal, it was slow, and it was killing people. Picture this. A 20-ton log breaks free on a slope. It rolls, picks up speed. There's nowhere to run in dense timber. Men scattered like leaves, but not everyone made it. The forests of the Northwest are filled with unmarked graves, bodies crushed under runaway timber, backs broken by cables that snapped. Lives ended because the tools couldn't match the task. The math was simple and terrible. The trees that built America were destroying the men trying to harvest them. And then there was the economic reality. Entire stands of ancient timber sat untouched because no one could figure out how to get them out. The lumber companies were hemorrhaging money. The growing nation was screaming for wood. Something had to change. Enter John McGiffert, a drawing board, a crazy idea. What if, and stay with me here, what if we built a machine that could walk, not roll, not slide, walk like some kind of industrial insect, lifting itself over obstacles, moving on legs instead of wheels? People thought he was insane. This was 1905. No hydraulics as we know them, no diesel engines, no GPS or computer controls. Just steam, steel, and one man's refusal to accept that mountains were unconquerable. McGiffert looked at the problem everyone else saw as impossible and asked a different question. Not, how do we move through this terrain, but how do we move above it? The answer would shake the mountains themselves. Here's what McGiffert designed, and I need you to really visualize this because it sounds like something from a fever dream. A massive steel platform, 40 feet long, mounted on railroad wheels, but these wheels don't always touch the ground. Above the platform, a steam boiler and drum system, cables everywhere, a loading boom that could swing in a full circle, and here's the genius part, the 4 retractable legs. Steel limbs that could extend down, lift the entire machine off its wheels, and let it step over the railroad tracks it was sitting on. The machine would literally walk over itself. Think about that engineering challenge for a moment. This is 1902 when the first prototype appears. The Wright brothers haven't even flown yet. And McGiffert is building a 42-ton mechanical creature that can lift its own weight on hydraulic legs and reposition itself. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. The loader would roll into position on standard railroad wheels. Then, when it needed to move forward but the track was blocked by loaded cars, it would do something no other machine could do. It would stand up. The operator would engage the hydraulic system. 4 legs would descend on either side of the tracks. Each leg ended in a wide steel foot, designed to distribute weight on soft forest floor. The legs would plant themselves, take the load, and then the entire 40-foot platform would lift off the rails. Suspended. hanging in mid-air above the tracks. The loaded train cars could roll underneath, and once they cleared, the McGiffert would lower itself back down, retract its legs, and continue working. It looked awkward. It looked strange. Contemporary observers described it as ungainly, almost comical in its movements. But it worked. The boom was the business end. A long steel arm extending from the rotating platform, mounted on a turret bearing that let it swing a complete 360 degrees. Cables ran from steam-powered drums through the boom down to hooks and chokers. This boom could reach out into the forest, snag multi-ton logs, and lift them like they were kindling. At full extension with the boom raised, the McGiffert stood 40 feet tall, a steel giant towering over the landscape. The operator sat in a small control station, managing steam pressure, cable tension, boom rotation, conducting a symphony of steel and steam. And the numbers: an experienced crew could load 30 to 40 logs per day. Hundreds of tons of timber, trees that would have taken days to move with animals, were being hoisted onto flat cars in minutes. But here's what made the McGiffert truly revolutionary. It wasn't just about speed, it was about access. Remember those mountain slopes where horses couldn't go? The McGiffert could work there, set up the rails along the contour, position the loader, and that boom could reach down into ravines, up onto ridges. The machine expanded the possible. Suddenly, timber that was economically worthless because it couldn't be reached became valuable. The first McGiffert appeared in the woods in 1902. Within 3 years, lumber companies across the Northwest were clamoring for them. The Clyde Iron Works in Duluth, Minnesota started building them as fast as they could, and they kept building. Through the 1900s, through the 1910s, into the 1920s, nearly 1,000 McGiffert loaders would eventually roll out of that factory, each one a testament to one man's refusal to accept limitations. But power, real power, always comes with a price. And the McGiffert was about to teach the lumber industry just how high that price could be. Let me take you inside a working day with a McGiffert loader, because understanding how this machine operated is understanding why it became both legendary and feared. Dawn breaks over a logging operation in the Cascade Range. The McGiffert sits on temporary tracks laid specifically for this cutting area. Steam is already building in the boiler. You need pressure before you can do anything. The crew arrives. Riggers. Choker setters. The boom operator. Each man knows his job because mistakes here don't just cost time. They cost lives. The process begins. Out in the cutting area, fallers have already dropped the giants. Trees that stood for 300 years are now horizontal. Some of these logs weigh 15-20 tons. Their bark is still weeping sap. The smell of fresh-cut timber fills the air. The choker setters move in. These are the bravest or craziest men on the crew. They're wrapping steel cables around logs that could roll at any moment. One slip, one shift in weight, and you're crushed. They work fast, loop the cable, secure the choker, signal the boom operator. Back at the McGiffert, the operator sees the signal. He engages the drum. The cable goes taut. Starts to sing with tension. The boom swings into position, that full 360-degree rotation letting it reach in any direction, and then the lift begins. Watch what happens next. The log moves, not smoothly. It tears free from the earth with a sound like thunder. Dirt and rocks cascade off. The boom takes the strain. Steel groaning but holding. The log rises, swings through the air. A 20-ton pendulum suspended 40 feet up. This is where the operator's skill matters. Too fast, and the log swings wild. Too slow, and you're wasting time. He's reading the weight by feel, by sound, by the way the cables vibrate. There are no load sensors, no digital readouts, just experience and instinct. The log swings over the flat car. The operator lowers it. The impact when it hits makes the entire train shudder. The choker is released. The boom swings back for another 30 to 40 logs per day. The math works out to moving hundreds of tons. But here's the thing. It's not just about the lifting. Remember those legs? Every few hours the train is full. Time to move it out and bring in empties. But the McGiffert is sitting right on the tracks. This is where the magic happens. The operator positions the machine, makes sure it's stable. Then he activates the leg system. 4 hydraulic rams begin extending. You can hear them, a mechanical hiss as pressure builds. The steel legs descend on either side of the tracks. Each foot finds purchase on the forest floor. The operator checks the positioning. Everything has to be perfect. Then comes the moment that never stopped amazing witnesses. The legs take the weight, all 42 tons of it. The McGiffert lifts off the rails, the entire platform suspended on 4 points. It looks impossible, like watching a building stand up and walk. The locomotive hooks onto the loaded cars, pulls them forward. They roll underneath the McGiffert, passing through the space where the machine was just sitting. Once they clear, empties are backed in. The legs extend further, letting the machine step completely over the new cars. Then, with mathematical precision, the McGiffert lowers itself back down. The wheels touch rail, the legs retract, and the whole process begins again. Some crews could do this repositioning in under 20 minutes. A dance of steel and steam that defied everything people thought machines could do. But watch what's happening to the forest around this operation. The McGiffert's boom has a reach of about 60 feet. That means a circle of destruction 120 feet across. Every tree in that radius is fair game. The cables drag through underbrush. Smaller trees are crushed as logs swing over them. The steel feet of the legs, even distributed, compact the soil with every step. And this is one machine, on one setting, in one valley. Now multiply that across the Pacific Northwest, across Northern California, into British Columbia. Nearly 1,000 McGifferts working simultaneously at the peak, each one claiming its circle of forest, each one moving hundreds of tons per day. The numbers become staggering. The U.S. Forest Service would later call the tower Skeeter systems, which included McGifferts and their cousin, the Lidgerwood, the most destructive form of logging ever devised, not because of what they cut, but because of how they cut it. A Lidgerwood skidder with a crew of 25 could produce 125,000 board feet per day. Impressive, right? But it was actually less efficient per person than older steam donkey operations with 18 men. The big machines weren't just harvesting timber. They were consuming everything: fuel, men, forest floor, even the future productivity of the land. And here's the darkest irony. The reports from that era note that these machines could work selectively, could be operated with care, could minimize damage. The phrase used was, if the crew will take the necessary trouble. But would they? Did they? When you're paid by production, when the company demands maximum output, when the machine itself seems to demand feeding, who takes the trouble? The McGiffert could be a precision instrument. In reality, it was often a blunt weapon, and the forests paid the price in ways that wouldn't become clear for decades. But the human cost, that was immediate. That was counted in bodies. Let's talk about what the promotional materials never mentioned, what the lumber company records buried in footnotes, what the families of loggers knew with devastating clarity. The McGiffert Loader was a killer, not intentionally, not maliciously, but with the cold indifference of any machine pushed beyond safe limits by men desperate to meet quotas. Picture this scene. It happened dozens of times across dozens of camps. A choker setter is working under a suspended log. Maybe he's adjusting the cable. Maybe he's clearing debris. The boom operator can't see him. The log itself blocks the view. Someone signals to lower. The operator responds. And in the 3 seconds it takes for the message to register as wrong, a 20-ton log descends. There's no emergency stop, no quick release. By the time anyone realizes the mistake, it's over. The really brutal part? You couldn't just lift the log back off. The McGiffert was positioned for loading, not rescue. You'd need to reposition the boom, reset the cables, coordinate the lift, all while a man was dying underneath, if he wasn't already dead. Some camps kept detailed accident logs. Most didn't. The ones that survived tell stories written in terse, bureaucratic language that barely conceals the horror. Rigger caught between log and rail car. Choker setter struck by swinging timber. A boom operator crushed when cable parted under load. That last one deserves explanation. Steel cable under tension is a coiled spring of death. When it snaps, and cables did snap, worn thin by friction and weather, the two ends whipped back with enough force to cut a man in half. The boom operator sat right in the path. He had nowhere to run. The control station was open to the elements. No protection, just him and the machinery. And then there was the boiler itself. 42 tons of machine. At the heart of it, a steam boiler running at pressure. Fire and water and steel pushed to their limits every single day. Boiler explosions were a constant threat in the steam age. When they happened on locomotives, it was catastrophic. When they happened on a McGiffert suspended 40 feet in the air, the blast would scatter debris across acres. Scalding steam would flash cook anyone nearby. The platform itself could collapse, bringing tons of steel crashing down. There are accounts of McGiffert explosions that killed entire crews. Not just the operator. Everyone within blast radius. But here's what really haunts me about the human cost. The deaths weren't random accidents. They were the inevitable mathematics of the operation. Work faster, the companies demanded. Load more logs per day. Cut costs. Maximize output. So corners got cut. Worn cables stayed in service one more day. Boiler maintenance was postponed. Crew sizes were reduced. Fewer eyes watching for danger. Fewer hands to help when things went wrong. Men worked longer shifts. Fatigue making them sloppy, making them slow to react. The McGiffert was designed with certain safety margins, but those margins assumed proper maintenance, adequate crew size, reasonable production demands. Reality gave the machine none of those things. And the forest itself was complicit in the killing. Logs on steep slopes, unpredictable terrain, weather that turned tracks to mud and made everything slippery. You're operating a 42-ton machine with steam-age technology in conditions that would challenge modern equipment. One McGiffert operator described it as dancing with a giant on a cliff edge in the rain. Every movement calculated, every decision potentially fatal, and you're doing this 10-12 hours a day. The records from McCloud River Lumber Company show something fascinating and terrible. They used McGifferts extensively from 1907 into the mid-1920s, then switched to steam donkeys and other methods. The McGifferts came back in the late 1920s when tractors arrived. But here's what's telling. Each transition was marked by a period of adjustment where accident rates spiked. Why? Because the McGiffert demanded specific skills, specific awareness. Men who'd worked with other equipment had to relearn danger, and some of them didn't survive the learning curve. But the human cost wasn't just counted in deaths. Think about the survivors, loggers with crushed limbs. In an era before modern surgery, that often meant amputation with a saw and whiskey for anesthetic. Men with backs broken by falls or impacts, spending the rest of their lives in pain or paralyzed. Families left without breadwinners in camps, miles from any town. No workers' compensation, no safety regulations, no OSHA. If you got hurt, you got fired. If you died, your family got nothing, except maybe a collection taken up by fellow workers who knew they could be next. The lumber companies kept building McGifferts because they made money. Nearly 1,000 machines. Each one justified by production numbers that looked great on paper. But those numbers never showed the real cost, never counted the bodies buried in lonely forest graves, never calculated the value of the lives destroyed in pursuit of board feet. The McGiffert wasn't just cutting timber. It was cutting through human lives with the same mechanical indifference it showed to ancient trees. And through it all, the machine kept working, kept walking on its steel legs, kept lifting impossible weights, kept feeding the insatiable appetite of a growing nation that needed wood more than it needed to know where that wood came from or what it cost to get it. But here's the thing about history. It doesn't care about the cost. It only remembers what worked. And the McGiffert worked. Between 1902 and 1930, the Clyde Iron Works in Duluth, Minnesota became the beating heart of an industrial revolution. Nearly 1,000 McGiffert loaders rolled out of that factory, 1,000 machines. Each one a 42-ton declaration that mountains could be conquered, that forests could be harvested from terrain that had defeated every previous attempt. Think about that production scale for a moment. This wasn't a novelty. This wasn't an experimental technology that a few companies tried. This was mass adoption across an entire industry. From the pine forests of the Intermountain West to the Douglas fir giants of the Pacific coast, from Northern California's redwood country to the forests of British Columbia. Wherever there were big trees on difficult terrain, McGifferts followed. The geography of American logging changed because of these machines. Before the McGiffert, certain stands of timber were written off as inaccessible, too steep, too remote, too dangerous. After the McGiffert, nothing was off limits. If you could lay temporary track, and you could lay track almost anywhere, you could get a McGiffert there. And if you could get a McGiffert there, you could take every tree. The lumber companies developed entire strategies around these machines. They'd scout the best timber stands, old growth, massive trees, the really valuable stuff. Then, they'd reserve the McGifferts for those operations. The best machines for the best wood. The McGifferts were the elite units of the logging army, and the economics were brutal in their clarity. One McGiffert with a crew of 20 could harvest more timber in a week than a traditional operation with 50 men and 100 animals could move in a month. The math wasn't subtle. Every lumber company that didn't adopt the technology fell behind. Every company that did became more profitable. But there were variations on the McGiffert concept, competitors trying to claim market share. The Lidgerwood Tower skidder was the main rival, an 85-foot tower, stationary, with massive drums powered by a 12x14 engine, 4 loading carriages, a giant compared to the McGiffert's 40-foot boom. The Lidgerwood could move more timber in a single session, but it couldn't walk, couldn't reposition itself, had to be dismantled and moved when a cutting area was exhausted. The McGiffert's mobility was its killer advantage. Companies would run the numbers. A Lidgerwood with 25 men producing 125,000 board feet per day versus a steam donkey operation with 18 men producing more per capita. The big machines looked impressive, but the efficiency was questionable. Yet they kept building them, kept deploying them, because raw production numbers mattered more than efficiency. The nation's appetite for lumber wasn't slowing down. Cities were exploding. Railroads were expanding. Every new town needed millions of board feet, and every board that rolled out of the mountains, every piece of timber loaded onto a flat car, was feeding that growth. The McGiffert wasn't just a logging machine, it was infrastructure for expansion. The wood it harvested became the buildings of San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake, the homes of Seattle's booming population, the railroad ties connecting remote towns to the rest of America. There's a photograph from 1915. I wish you could see it. A McGiffert standing at full height on a mountain slope, boom extended, a massive log suspended in midair. Behind it, a hillside stripped bare of trees. In the foreground, a crew of 20 men, tiny figures dwarfed by their machine. That image captures something essential about the era. The scale, the ambition, the absolute confidence that bigger was better, that nature existed to be conquered, that any cost was acceptable in service of progress. The McCloud River Lumber Company ran multiple McGifferts through the peak years. 1907 to the mid-1920s was their first boom period. Then, steam donkeys took over for a while, cheaper to operate, simpler to maintain. But when tractors arrived in the late 1920s, the McGifferts came back. Because even with newer technology, nothing could match their ability to work steep terrain while loading directly onto rail cars. That's the thing about truly revolutionary technology. It doesn't get replaced immediately. It evolves, adapts, finds niches where its specific capabilities still matter. The McGifferts were rolling through the 1920s at peak efficiency. Crews had figured out the optimal workflows. Maintenance schedules were refined. The machines themselves had been improved through iterations, stronger cables, better hydraulics, more reliable boilers. This was the golden age, the empire at its height. But empires always fall. And the McGiffert's empire was about to face something it couldn't step over on hydraulic legs. Technology moves faster than steel. Something new appears in the forests. A Caterpillar tractor, diesel-powered, crawling on continuous tracks, smaller than a McGiffert. Simpler. But here's what matters. It doesn't need rails. Watch what happens next. It happens fast. The tractor can go anywhere, up slopes, through mud, across terrain where laying track would take days. It doesn't need a crew of 20. 5 men can operate it. It doesn't need a boiler that takes hours to build steam pressure, turn the key, or rather crank the engine, and it's working. And most devastating of all, it's cheaper. The math that had favored the McGiffert suddenly inverts. A 42-ton machine requiring rails, steam fuel, specialized operators, and constant maintenance versus a mobile tractor that burns diesel and goes home every night. 1927 to 1928, in those 2 years, the steam age in logging effectively ends. Well, not completely. Not everywhere. But the momentum shifts so fast, it's like watching a landslide. The McCloud River Lumber Company switches over, other operations follow. The McGifferts that had dominated the best timber stands are suddenly relegated to secondary roles. Then to backup status. Then to sitting idle. But this isn't a clean transition. It's messy, painful, full of false starts and regional variations. Some companies hold on to their McGifferts through the 1930s. They've invested in the machines, trained crews, built infrastructure around them. You don't abandon that overnight. The McGifferts keep working, but they're ghosts of themselves, working the margins, the leftovers. The Clyde Iron Works sees the writing on the wall. Around 1930, they build their last McGiffert. Nearly 3 decades of continuous production ends. The assembly line that had pumped out 1,000 machines goes quiet. Think about what that means. An entire skilled workforce, pattern makers, boiler makers, hydraulic specialists, suddenly irrelevant. The institutional knowledge of building these machines evaporates. When they stop making them, they stop knowing how to make them. But some McGifferts keep working. Through the Depression, through World War II, into the 1950s, these machines were built tough. Maintained properly, a McGiffert could operate for decades. The question was, never could they work. It was whether anyone still needed them to. By the 1960s, it's over. The last working McGifferts are being retired. One operation in California keeps one running until 1978, a testament to either dedication or stubbornness, depending on your perspective. But that's an outlier, an anachronism. The final indignity, most of them were scrapped. 42 tons of steel had value as raw material. Why preserve an obsolete logging machine when you could melt it down and sell the metal? Nearly 1,000 built. And when the dust settled, only 6 or 7 survived. Let me tell you where they ended up. Because these survivors tell their own story. Collier Memorial State Park in Oregon has 2. One of them caught in the 242 fire of 2020. The photos are heartbreaking. This massive machine, survivor of decades in the forest, nearly destroyed by the same element it had harnessed, steam and fire, but they restored it. By 2025 it stood again, a phoenix in steel. The Southern Forest Heritage Museum in Louisiana has 2 more, odd location for Pacific Northwest machines. But that's how history scatters artifacts. These McGifferts worked southern pine, not western fir. Same machine, different forest, same story of conquest and consequence. The Lake Superior Railroad Museum in Duluth has one. Fitting, really. Duluth is where they were born. The Clyde Iron Works was local. This particular McGiffert worked for the Weed Lumber Company until 1978. The last of its kind, still earning its keep. And here's where it gets strange. One McGiffert lies upside down at the bottom of a lake in British Columbia. How does a 42-ton machine end up inverted underwater? There's a story there, probably involving ice, bad positioning, and physics having the last word. It sits there now, a wreck, a tomb, an archaeological site for future generations who'll wonder what the hell this thing was. There might be a 7th. Reports from 1999 mention one in El Salto, Durango, Mexico. Maybe it's still there. Maybe it was scrapped. Maybe it never existed and someone misidentified equipment. The historical record gets fuzzy at the margins. 6 or 7 survivors out of nearly 1,000. That's a survival rate of less than 1%. But here's what really strikes me. These machines weren't just working, they were dominating. They were the pinnacle of their technology. And then within a single decade, they went from essential to obsolete. Technology doesn't fade. It collapses. One day you're the future. The next day you're the past. There's no gentle transition, no gradual retirement, just the brutal calculus of economics and efficiency. The McGifferts that survived did so by accident of location or someone's sentimental decision to preserve rather than scrap. They're museum pieces now, static displays. Their hydraulic legs will never extend again. Their booms will never lift another log. They stand frozen, monuments to an era that devoured forests and men with equal appetite. But the mountains remember. The slopes they worked still show the scars. Stand on a logged-over slope in the Pacific Northwest today. Look carefully at the terrain, you'll see it. The ghost infrastructure of the McGiffert era. Old railroad grades carved into hillsides, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation, but still visible as unnatural contours. The ground where steel feet once planted themselves, compacted so thoroughly that even a century later, trees struggle to root there. Patterns in the forest, regrowth that reveal the circular reach of a boom, dense young timber surrounding an open center where the McGiffert once stood. The land keeps records that humans forget. But let's talk about what the McGiffert actually accomplished. Because beyond the blood and the obsolescence, there's a transformation that can't be denied. This machine redrew the economic geography of America. Before the McGiffert, accessible timber was being exhausted. The easy forests, flat terrain, river access, were already cut. What remained was locked behind walls of elevation and distance. The nation needed that wood. Cities were growing exponentially. The construction boom wasn't slowing. The McGiffert unlocked billions of board feet, literally billions. Timber that would have remained standing for lack of harvest technology became the raw material of expansion. Every major city on the West Coast has buildings framed with wood that was loaded by a McGiffert. San Francisco's reconstruction, Portland's growth, Seattle's transformation from frontier town to major port. The McGiffert was there, invisible in the finished structures but essential to their existence. The railroad ties that connected the continent, many of them came from McGiffert operations. The mine timbers that shored up tunnels, extracting copper and silver and gold, McGiffert wood. The wooden water pipes of early cities, the bridge timbers, the pilings for docks, all of it flowing from forests, the McGiffert made accessible. In purely economic terms, the machine was an unqualified success. It did what it was designed to do. It moved timber from impossible places to market. It made companies rich. It employed thousands. It built infrastructure. But economics don't tell the whole story. There's a question that haunts every technological revolution. Could it have been done differently? The reports from the era note that McGifferts could operate with minimal environmental damage if the crew will take the necessary trouble. That phrase, if the technology wasn't inherently destructive, the business model was. What if companies had prioritized selective logging over clear cutting? What if they'd invested in larger crews and slower production schedules? What if safety had mattered more than board feet per day? These aren't hypothetical questions. They're indictments. The McGiffert was a tool. Tools have no morality. They do what we design them to do, the way we choose to use them. The destruction wasn't the machine's fault. The deaths weren't the machine's responsibility. They were ours. We built a system that demanded maximum extraction at minimum cost. We created economic pressures that made brutality inevitable. We celebrated production numbers while ignoring human and environmental costs. The McGiffert was just the implement of our choices. And here's the hardest truth. We'd do it again. Not with McGifferts. That technology is obsolete. But the same pattern repeats with every new advancement. New tools, same pressures, same trade-offs, different costs, same unwillingness to count them. The forests the McGifferts cut are growing back. Second growth, third growth, not the same as old growth. Those trees took centuries to produce, but green nonetheless. Nature is resilient in ways that make human timescales seem trivial. The men who died under those machines, their dust, names on forgotten memorial stones, if they have stones at all. Their sacrifices bought us the cities we live in. We use their legacy every day without knowing their names. And the machine itself, 6 survivors, museum pieces. Tourists walk past them, take photos, read the placards. Interesting old equipment, they think. Maybe they wonder how it worked. Probably they don't think about the human cost, the environmental toll, the complex legacy of progress. There's a McGiffert in Oregon, fully restored after the 2020 fire. It stands under open sky, boom extended, frozen in the act of reaching for a load it will never lift. Children climb on it. School groups listen to guides explain the mechanics. No one talks about the bodies crushed underneath machines just like this one. No one mentions the forests stripped bare. No one asks whether the speed was worth the cost. We remember the engineering. We forget the consequences. But the mountains know. The slopes that felt those steel feet know. The valleys where the boom's shadows swept in circles know. They remember what we choose to forget. The McGiffert wasn't just a machine that cut America's timber. It was a mirror showing us what we were willing to sacrifice for progress. Forests, lives, future possibilities, all thrown into the furnace of expansion. And the reflection it shows, we're still looking at it. Still making the same choices. Still counting board feet and GDP while leaving other costs uncounted. The McGiffert's era is over. Its last working day came and went in 1978. The boilers are cold. The cables are still. The hydraulic legs will never walk again. But the questions it raises, those are eternal. What are we willing to destroy to build? Who are we willing to sacrifice for progress? How much is enough? When does the cost outweigh the gain? The McGiffert can't answer those questions. It's just steel and steam and history. We're the ones who have to answer, and we're still getting it wrong. The mountains remember. Even if we don't, there's one more thing I need to tell you. One more piece of this story that refuses to let go. Go to the Lake Superior Railroad Museum in Duluth. Walk past the locomotives and the passenger cars. There, in a corner of the grounds, you'll find it. A McGiffert Loader, the one from Weed Lumber Company, the one that worked until 1978. Stand next to it, really look at it. 40 feet of steel platform. The boom extended like a frozen gesture, the wheels that rolled on thousands of miles of temporary track. The legs retracted now, that once lifted this giant off the ground. Run your hand along the steel if they let you. Feel the rust, the pitting from decades of weather. This metal was forged in Duluth over a century ago. Shaped by workers whose names we don't know. Assembled into something that shouldn't have been possible with 1902 technology. This machine worked for 76 years. Think about that. Most technology is obsolete in a decade. This one kept earning its keep for 3/4 of a century. Through the decline of steam, through the rise of diesel, through wars and depressions and technological revolutions, it worked because someone kept it working. Some crew chief who maintained the boiler properly, some company that saw value in the old ways, some operator who understood the machine's quirks and capabilities, and then one day in 1978, someone made the last lift, loaded the last log. Why, shut down the boiler for the final time. Maybe they knew it was the end. Or maybe they thought it was just another day, another shutdown, and tomorrow they'd fire it up again. But tomorrow never came. The machine that had walked through forests, that had lifted mountains of timber, that had survived longer than almost any of its siblings, it finally stopped. Not because it broke, not because it couldn't work anymore, but because the world had moved on. There's something almost unbearably sad about that. This machine did everything asked of it. It was tough, reliable, capable, and in the end, none of that mattered. Progress doesn't care about loyalty. Economics doesn't reward longevity. You're useful until you're not, and then you're history. But here's what strikes me standing next to that McGiffert in Duluth. It's still teaching us not how to log. That technology is obsolete. Not how to build. We have better methods now. But how to think about the relationship between human ambition and technological capability. The McGiffert represents a moment when we learned we could overcome any physical obstacle. Mountains, we'll walk over them on steel legs. Trees too big to move, we'll lift them anyway. Terrain too rough for animals. We'll make machines that don't need smooth ground. That was intoxicating. That power, that capability, and we're still drunk on it. Every time we develop a new technology that lets us extract faster, build bigger, reach further, we face the McGiffert's question again. Just because we can, should we? Just because it's profitable, is it right? Just because the technology exists, must we use it to its limits? The McGiffert had the capacity for careful, selective operation. The historical record is clear on that, but capacity doesn't matter if the economic system demands maximum extraction. If the pressure is always to do more, faster, cheaper. We built a tool that could have been used wisely. We chose to use it brutally. That choice wasn't the machine's. It was ours, and we keep making that choice with different tools. Same pattern. Standing next to this last working McGiffert, I think about the operator who ran it in 1978. Was he proud of the machine? Did he understand its history? Did he know he was piloting the last of a breed? Or was it just a job, just another day moving timber? Clock in, fire up the boiler, load the logs, clock out. The machine's significance invisible beneath the routine of work. Most history is like that, the momentous disguised as the ordinary. The last of something looking exactly like all the times before. Somewhere in a forest in California, there's a log. The last log ever loaded by a McGiffert. It looks like every other log. It became lumber like every other log. It's probably part of a building somewhere, indistinguishable from the boards around it. But it's the end of an era made flesh, or rather, made wood. The McGiffert in Duluth will never load another log. The one in Oregon will never walk on its steel legs again. The ones in Louisiana stand frozen in museums. The one at the bottom of that lake in British Columbia will rust until there's nothing left but memory and sediment. 6 or 7 survivors, monuments to the era when America learned to harvest the unharvested, to reach the unreachable, to conquer the unconquerable. They're teaching museums now, not logging camps. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe the best use of these machines is to make us think, to make us question, to make us remember that every technological triumph carries costs that spreadsheets don't capture. The mountains still bear the scars. The old railroad grades still cut across slopes. The compressed earth where steel feet stood still resists tree growth. But the forest is returning. Slower than we'd like. Different than before. But returning. The machine's era has passed. The questions it raises never will. What will we sacrifice for progress? What will we preserve? How will we balance capability with responsibility? Power with wisdom? The McGiffert can't answer those questions. It's steel. It's history. It's silent. We have to answer them. Every generation, every technology, every choice. The 42-ton beast that walked through mountains and shook the foundations of the earth now stands still. Museum piece, artifact, ghost. But its legacy walks among us still, in every choice we make about what to build and what to preserve, what to take and what to leave, how fast to move, and what costs we're willing to accept. The mountains remember. The machines remember. The question is, will we? If you walk through a modern city, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, look at the older buildings. The ones with wooden frames, the ones built in the early 1900s through the 1920s. That wood came from somewhere. It came from forests so remote they seemed untouchable. From slopes so steep that men died trying to work them. From trees so massive that a single trunk could yield enough lumber to frame an entire house. And it came out on the back of machines, like the McGiffert. Machines that shouldn't have worked but did. Machines that walked on steel legs and lifted the impossible. We built our cities on that foundation, literally. The floors you walk on, the walls around you, the beams holding up the roof. Somewhere in that ancestry is wood that was loaded by a 42-ton mechanical spider that defied gravity and common sense. We don't think about that. We don't have to. The work is done. The forests are cut. The machines are museum pieces. But the story isn't over, because we're still doing it. Different tools, same impulse. We're still finding the unreachable and reaching it. Still encountering the impossible and conquering it. Still counting the profits, while leaving other costs uncounted. The McGiffert was just one chapter, one machine, one era. But the book we're writing, that continues. Every day, every choice, every trade-off between what we can do and what we should do. The McGiffert Loader changed America. It opened forests that shaped the economy of the West. It employed thousands. It built cities. It created wealth. It also destroyed irreplaceable ecosystems. It killed men. It stripped mountainsides bare. It prioritized speed over sustainability, profit over prudence, capability over consequence. Both things are true. History isn't simple. Progress isn't clean. The machines we celebrate are often the same machines that cost us more than we wanted to pay. 6 survivors remain: rust and memory, steel and silence. They stand in museums and parks, teaching lessons we're still learning to hear. On the mountains bear their scars with the patience of geological time. The forests regrow with the resilience of life. The cities built with their timber stand as monuments to both human ingenuity and human appetite. And somewhere, maybe in a forgotten corner of Oregon, maybe deep in British Columbia, maybe in places we've lost track of, there might be traces still: old cable, rusted track, the compressed earth where steel feet once stood. The McGiffert walked through history for less than a century, but its footprints remain, not just in the physical landscape, in the choices we still face, the questions we still ask, the balance we still seek between capability and wisdom, between progress and preservation, between what we can take and what we should leave. The 42-ton beast that shook mountains now sleeps. The forests it harvested are becoming forests again. The men who operated it are gone. The era that birthed it has passed, but the echo of its walking, that rhythmic thunder of steel legs lifting and planting, that still reverberates through our choices. Every time we push technology to its limits, every time we prioritize speed over safety, every time we extract without thinking about what comes after, the McGiffert is teaching us still. If we're willing to listen, if we're willing to remember, if we're willing to ask ourselves, what are we building? What are we destroying? And is the trade-off worth it? The mountains know the answer. They've always known. We're the ones still learning. The steel giant stands frozen, the boom extended toward a sky it will never reach again, the wheels motionless on tracks long since torn up, the legs retracted, their walking days over. But the story keeps walking. Through us, through our choices, through the cities we build and the forests we preserve or destroy. The McGiffert's era has ended. Our era and our responsibility continues.